than both Australia and Europe, and yet it has no native population, being the only continent considered to be uninhabitable to humans due to its bitter cold weather and barrenness, with it in fact being considered the coldest, driest, and windiest continent on the entire planet. And as a result, it's not just our kind that avoids it, but pretty much all kinds of animals, including, in contrary to popular belief, polar bears. On top of this, the largest fully terrestrial animal that lives in Antarctica year-round is literally only the size of an insect, seeing that that's what it is, an insect, the Antarctic midge, which thus also holds the title for being the continent's largest land predator. And even then, this guy is restricted to the ice-free coast of the continent, with the interior being home to no known non-microscopic organisms. So, in almost every sense, this is a pretty lifeless continent dominated by ice. Lots of it, with some areas being covered in layers that go down for over 3 miles or 4.8 kilometers. And as a whole, 70% of all of Earth's fresh water is trapped there in the form of ice. Yet, with all this said, as some of you might know, Antarctica hasn't always been a frozen wasteland. And in reality, from a geological standpoint, its icy era is a relatively new thing, as roughly 34 million years ago, during the Eocene period, it wasn't white, but rather green, and full of, unsurprisingly, much larger life, until that is the onset of the Cenozoic Ice Age. However, while that point was the last time it was a green continent, it wasn't then that it was necessarily the peak of Antarctica, so to speak, as that occurred much earlier. And if you truly wanted to see Antarctica in its craziest form, you would need to travel way back, before the age of mammals even began, to a time when dinosaurs ruled. In other words, the Jurassic period. Now, the Jurassic itself was not the wildest Antarctica would get, but it was an important time in Antarctica's history and set the stage for what would come. Already at the time, the continent of Pangaea had been slowly breaking apart for millions of years. Yet, a surprisingly good amount of its shape still held, and this included Antarctica's. As opposed to today, it was still connected to many other landmasses, sharing borders with Australia, India, and the larger supercontinent of Gondwana. And while it was more southern than the vast majority of continents back then, it wasn't as close to the pole as it currently is, with its longitude back then being more similar to southern parts of modern-day Chile and Argentina. And so, this aspect, combined with the overall warmer temperatures in the Mesozoic, courtesy of our friend carbon dioxide, resulted in Antarctica being significantly warmer, ice-free, and green. And a trip here back then would have been, well, a trip, as nothing would have looked like how you typically imagine the continent. Instead of glaciers, rocks, and ice sheets, lush forests made up much of the lands, largely dominated by ancient families of conifers, ferns, and bennetails. And then instead of the very unvaried features, rivers, lakes, streams, and swamps all peppered the surface, leading to an environment that was not only more interesting to look at, but also quite friendly to life, so you could say. And given its still attachment to the rest of the world, the arrival of fauna was inevitable. And it is during this time, during the earlier days of the Jurassic, that the first dinosaurs on the continent appeared, as far as we know. And currently, the best studied Jurassic formation in Antarctica is Hansen Hill. And no, not that Hansen, but rather the site located on Mount Kirkpatrick, which dates back to the Middle Sinemurian. Today, it's surrounded by glaciers, but back then, as alluded to, the climate was far warmer, being around 17 to 18 degrees Celsius, with a similar climate to that of southern Chile. And it was here that dinosaurs such as coelophysoids roamed, as well as smaller neotheropods, ornithischians, and numerous massospondylids, which was one of the earliest known sauropodomorph families that were highly primitive and did not look anything like your stereotypical sauropod, with many being bipedal and surprisingly small, being no larger than a deer. On the flip side, you then had others, like the Glacialosaurus, who were significantly larger, and in its case, was up to 6 meters or 20 feet long, and similar in weight to an Asian elephant. And what's really interesting is that in some ways, Jurassic Antarctica represented a land stuck in time, as here, these primitive sauropodomorphs actually lived right alongside undescribed, yet true, derived sauropods. So, in comparison, it would almost be like if ancient humans came back today and then started living amongst us. So, pretty nifty. But what wasn't so nifty is that, along with this larger life, there were also a lot more creepy crawlies in general, ones that are obviously no longer found on this continent. And this included not only a variety of beetles, but also cockroaches. What's more is that today, Antarctica is the only continent in which a human could walk around on land for, say, forever, and can fully expect not to get eaten, as the largest land predator is that midge I mentioned earlier. Yet during the Jurassic, totally different story. As in Hansen